On the charges of first-degree murder, there's no bond on either of those charges.
56-year-old Louis Gaskin was dubbed the Ninja Killer after the murders in 1989.
He's got to be some kind of a crazy person to do something like that.
Was Mr. Gaskin acting under a delusional belief system in that he believed he was a ninja?
And then he asked, the last 4 words of his life was, look at my case.
Florida's ninja slayer, Louis Gaskin, was put down after committing a gruesome crime that landed him behind bars and eventually on the row. Let's dive into the life and crime of Gaskin. The tragic night. On the night of November 20, 1989, Louis Gaskin dressed for a slaughter. He planned to slay and pillage and wore a black ninja costume to blend in with the night. Ninjas are trained assassins, he later told police in a detailed confession, and Gaskin's dream was to be a ninja slayer.
The execution took place without incident.
56-year-old Louis Gaskin was dubbed the Ninja Killer after the murders in 1989.
The sentence of the state of Florida versus Louis Bernard Gaskin was carried out at 6:15 p.m.
As he walked out the door of his home, he had armed himself with a .22 caliber rifle. The unsuspecting victims of his dark fantasy lounged in the den of their Palm Coast, Florida home watching television. Robert Sturmfels, 56 years old, had settled into his recliner while his wife Georgette, 55, sat on the sofa. They'd never heard of the career criminal who was about to end their lives. Gaskin drove aimlessly through the darkness, searching for a target. When he passed 10 Ricker Place, he saw a light shining through a patch of woods. Parking his car beneath a grove of trees, he moved silently towards the house. He stood for long moments in silence, watching, scoping it ninja style. Then he circled the house. Once, twice, 6 times. Gaskin fancied himself a warrior moving in for the hunt. Looking through the den window, he had a clear shot. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, aimed and fired. Robert felt the bullet smash into his chest and came up out of his chair. Gaskin fired again. This time Robert collapsed onto the floor. It took Georgette a few seconds to realize what was happening. She leaped out of her chair and began running toward the hallway. A bullet took her down. Robert somehow stood again and began to stagger away. A third shot hit him in the back and he fell again. Georgette, bleeding heavily from a back wound, crawled down the hallway out of Gaskin's sight. He circled the house until he came to a set of French doors. There, he saw Georgette struggling to get to her feet. He fired once more and she crumpled to the floor.
For the second time in just a span of 7 weeks, Louis Gaskin was nicknamed the Ninja Killer. Florida's death chamber will be used to exact the ultimate punishment on a convicted killer. On December 20th, 1989, for stalking his Central Florida victims wearing all black, were murdered with a .22 caliber gun inside their Palm Coast home. Robert and Georgette Sturmfels, their bullet-riddled house, burglarized.
Gaskin inhaled the cool Florida air. Of all the many crimes he'd committed, burglary, robbery, selling and using drugs, physically exploiting children, he said this was the most exciting to him. He pulled a hunting knife and slashed a window screen at the back of the house. Unlatching the window, he entered. He reloaded his gun, walked over to Robert and shot him in the back of the head. Then he placed the barrel of the rifle against the back of Georgette's head and blew her brains out. Gaskin knew that the nearest house was a quarter of a mile away, so he relaxed as he gathered up items he could sell: jewelry, VCRs, lamps, a clock, an iron, household appliances. He looked for guns and drugs but found none. He checked Georgette's purse but found only credit cards. Robert's wallet contained $300 and more cards, so he took it. Gaskin placed the items in the victim's truck. He then drove through the woods to his own car where he transferred his loot. As he drove away, he left the bodies of 2 innocent victims inside the silent house. But Gaskin wasn't done. He'd spied a second secluded house just down the road. Joseph and Mary Rector had watched the 11 o'clock news and were on their way to bed when they heard a thump outside. Joseph investigated but saw nothing. The noises continued. Court documents state that after hearing a similar noise for a third time, Rector told his wife to call the sheriff. Mrs. Rector soon discovered that their phone was not working. They took the phone into the bedroom, where they tried plugging it into another jack without success. As he stood in the dark bedroom, Rector saw his window shade appear to explode. He looked down, saw blood, and realized he had been shot. The ninja slayer had thrown rocks and logs against the house to get his victims to come into view so he could shoot them. Robert and Mary rushed out of the house and climbed into their car. Robert needed to get to a hospital. As they screeched out of the driveway, more shots rang out and the Rectors heard bullets thudding into the car. With Mary driving, they were able to reach the hospital and call police. Detectives arrived at the Rector home. It had been ransacked. As they continued their investigation, a postal carrier noticed a broken window at the Sturmfels home and reported it. There, cops found the bodies of Robert and Georgette.
On the same night, he committed an armed robbery, burglary, and attempted murder of another couple. He discussed concerns that evidence of his mental illness was not given to the jury before it recommended death.
He directed deputies to a pond where he dumped evidence in several crimes. Gaskin was arrested less than 2 weeks after the murders. The same night of the murders, Joe and Noreen Rector were attacked and robbed. Joe shot in the chest.
It's going to be reckless.
I think he should die for what he did.
After burglarizing the Rector home, Gaskin drove to Alfonso Golden's home. He asked his cousin to store the stolen items for him. Golden agreed. Gaskin volunteered that he jacked the loot and told Golden that the victims are stiff. If you don't believe it, Gaskin bragged, watch the news. Golden, who also had a police record, waited a few days but eventually contacted police. Gaskin was arrested and quickly gave a detailed confession.
On the charges of first-degree murder, there's no bond on either of those charges.
Louis Gaskin was convicted of shooting and killing a couple in 1989 inside their Flagler County home. Gaskin confessed to the crimes, but filed numerous appeals over the years.
He led authorities to a canal where he'd hidden the credit cards, wallet, and other items. When asked why he'd done it, Gaskin replied, "God said no, the devil said yes. The devil had more of a hold on me than God did."
He's got to be some kind of a crazy person to do something like that.
Was Mr. Gaskin acting under a delusional belief system in that he believed he was a ninja, weird crusade?
Maria Deliberato is with Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty.
Sort of fighting for some...
His great-grandparents who beat him mercilessly. She points to the appeal documents that address abuse and abandonment he suffered as a child.
He's been locked up in the Florida Department of Corrections without a possibility of parole, and that should continue.
Arrest and trial. When the slayings became public, Gaskin became a suspect almost immediately after his girlfriend's cousin implicated Gaskin in the incident, saying that Gaskin came home soon after the slayings and said he was wrapping some presents. Gaskin was arrested soon after the slayings. Initially, he denied any involvement in the incident. However, he later confessed to the slayings and said they were completely random. He confessed in a taped statement to having urges to commit slaughter. He also confessed to slaying a coworker back in 1986. After a search of Gaskin's home, the presents were determined to be from the Sturmfels property. Local media reported that Gaskin quickly confessed to the crimes and told a psychologist before his trial that he knew what he was doing. The guilt was always there, Gaskin said. The devil had more of a hold on me than God did. I knew that I was wrong. I wasn't insane.
John Koch, an independent journalist, witnessed the moments leading up to Gaskin's execution.
If someone has a mental problem, you don't execute him. You heal him.
While reading his notes, he says Gaskin was calm and didn't look around the room.
You don't see how he's tightly, but you look at the arms. They're wrapped and he's strapped.
After a 2-month trial in July 1990, Gaskin was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree slaying and 2 counts of attempted slaying, and he was given 2 fatal sentences. In 2002, Gaskin unsuccessfully tried to appeal his sentence. He was incarcerated at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, from his arrest up until his punishment 34 years later. Gaskin's recent punishment. Florida finally fatally punished the Ninja Slayer on 12 April 2023. Gaskin, 56 years old at the time, was pronounced deceased at 6:15 p.m. after receiving a lethal injection, the governor's office said. Gaskin woke up at 4:45 a.m. and had his last meal at 9:45 a.m. The meal included barbecue pork ribs, pork and turkey neck, buffalo wings, shrimp fried rice, french fries, and water. Gaskin was visited by his sister Wednesday, but didn't meet with a spiritual advisor, McLaughlin Smith said.
He died by lethal injection without any complications, according to the prison. Aguido says he believes life in prison without parole would have been a better sentence for Gaskin. The victim's family members were not present.
We believe that killing people who kill people to stop people from killing people is silliness.
Prison officials say Louis Gaskin woke up just before 5 a.m., then 3 hours later, and then shortly after 6 o'clock, he was put to death. He received his last meal, and then his sister visited him for the last time.
No relatives of the victims had arranged to be in the witness room during the punishment, which was scheduled for 6 p.m. and started without delay. When asked if he had any final statement, Gaskin said, "Justice is not about the crime, it's not about the criminal, it's about the law." He then referred to the legal proceedings surrounding his case and the appeals and finished his statement saying, "Look at my case.
After spending more than 30 years on Florida's death row, freelance broadcast journalist John Koch has been witnessing state execution since the late 1980s. Convicted murderer Lewis Gaskin was executed by way of lethal injection. He witnessed Gaskin take his last breath.
He quietly went to sleep and he died. This one played out pretty good. And then he asked, the last 4 words of his life was, look at my case. He said that basically it's not about the crime or the criminal, it's about the law.
Gaskin began receiving the lethal cocktail of drugs at 6:02 p.m., causing him to breathe heavily as his chest rose and fell under a white sheet. The prison's warden went to check on whether Gaskin was still conscious at 6:05 p.m. He didn't respond. Gaskin's breathing appeared to stop at 6:07 p.m. A doctor entered the chamber at 6:14 p.m. to examine Gaskin and declared him deceased a minute later.
About 50 people who the event organizer says traveled more than 100 miles from Daytona. The group stood across the street from the death chamber expressing their opposition, protested Lewis Gaskin's execution. Gaskin's last words, according to someone who witnessed his execution, were, quote, "Look at my case." When the clock struck 6 o'clock Wednesday night,
That they are able to hear the bell.
protesters took turns hitting this bell.
We've been told by people who've been exonerated from death row.
Among the many who protested Gaskin's execution was Father Philip Aguido.
Death warrant for someone's execution, it's done in the name of the people of Florida.
He says he believes killing is wrong.
And we don't want the blood of anyone on us.
Gaskin's punishment came 6 weeks after Donald Dilbeck, 59, was put down for the 1990 slaying of Faye Vann, 44, in Tallahassee, and 3 weeks before the scheduled punishment of Darrell B. Barwick for slaying Rebecca Went, 24, in 1986 in Panama City. Gaskin's demise marked the state's 101st fatal punishment since the reinstatement of the capital punishment in 1976. There are an additional 297 people on Florida's End Row, which is located at Florida State Prison about 40 miles southwest of Jacksonville. The state and U.S. Supreme Courts rejected appeals Gaskin filed since his fatal warrant was signed. The latest denial came a day before his fatal punishment. That's all for today, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you the next time.